Equals. By late 1943, along the hedgerows and frozen fields of the Western Front, German infantrymen began speaking of a weapon they feared more than tanks, more than aircraft, and in some cases more than death itself. It was not something they could see advancing across a field or hear idling in the sky. It announced itself only as a sound thin at first, almost curious before becoming final. Veterans would later say that once you learned to recognize it, the fear came faster than the blast. There was a logic to survival at the front. Tanks could be hidden from, avoided with terrain and patience. Aircraft passed quickly, their danger intense but brief. Even machine guns had direction and rhythm. Artillery was different. It did not hunt individuals. It erased areas. And the American artillery, arriving in growing strength in 1943 and 1944, operated with a speed and coordination the German army had not faced before. The irony was that this most feared weapon was rarely seen. There was no silhouette, no advancing column. The gun sat miles behind the lines, concealed, methodical, almost anonymous. What reached the infantry was not the weapon itself, but its mathematics, angles, timing, calibration, translated into sound. A rising whistle, a tearing crack, then the ground lifting as if struck from below. German soldiers learned quickly that courage meant little once the firing began. Survival depended on timing. The first shells were not always the deadliest. It was the pattern that mattered, the pauses, the adjustments, the moment when the barrage shifted without warning. Men who moved too early died tired. Men who moved too late were buried where they lay. The sensory memory stayed with them. The whistling descent that seemed to sharpen the air. The concussion that flattened lungs and thoughts alike. And then, after, the silence unnatural, heavy, broken only by falling soil and the sound of men calling names that would not answer. What made the American artillery truly terrifying was not its explosive power, but its predictability. Or, rather, its lack of it. Fire could arrive within minutes of a request, sometimes seconds. Fear began before the first shell landed, because by the time the sound was heard, the calculations had already been made. And somewhere far behind the front, American crews were refining that system, still further unaware that their efficiency had already changed the psychology of the battlefield in ways no explosion ever could. German doctrine had been built around confrontation. Direct fire could be answered with direct action return fire, maneuver, withdrawal under cover, even in defeat. There was a logic that preserved a sense of control. A soldier could see the threat, measure it, and respond. That belief had shaped an army for decades. In Normandy and in Italy, it began to fail. American artillery did not announce itself with movement or intent. It arrived without warning and without a visible enemy. There were no muzzle flashes to target. No engines to hear approaching. One moment the line was quiet. The next, the air itself seemed to fracture. Veterans would later say the most unsettling part was not the explosion, but the realization that nothing could be done to stop what was already on its way. The irony was cruel. German infantry and officers were often tactically skilled, experienced in defensive warfare, adept at reading terrain, but none of that mattered when fire descended from miles away with mathematical indifference. Skill could not outmaneuver a firing table. Training could not anticipate a correction transmitted by wire in seconds. Trenches, once symbols of protection, became traps. Men pressed deeper into the earth as shells found them anyway, collapsing walls, burying exits, turning cover into confinement. In Italy's rocky soil and Normandy's hedgerows, the ground that had promised safety began to betray those who relied on it. Staying still was dangerous. Moving was worse. What veterans described afterward was not panic, but helplessness. Panic implied motion, reaction, chaos. Artillery allowed none of that. It reduced men to waiting, counting seconds, listening for the next sound, measuring survival by chance rather than choice. The absence of agency was what broke them. Not fear, but the knowledge that courage had no role to play. This was the revelation that spread quietly through the ranks. Artillery did not simply kill. It stripped soldiers of control, of decision, of meaning in their own actions. War became something that happened to them, not something they could influence. And as this understanding settled in the frontline positions of Europe, American commanders were learning just how powerful that invisible pressure could be, preparing to apply it on a scale the battlefield had not yet seen. By 1944, the skies over Western Europe belonged largely to the Allies. German soldiers knew this. They lived under the constant presence of aircraft fighters, prowling roads, bombers crossing overhead in steady formations. Yet when veterans spoke of fear, it was rarely the planes they mentioned first. Their attention remained fixed on the ground, on what waited unseen beyond the horizon. Air attacks were violent, but brief. A strafing run lasted seconds. Bombers passed, dropped, and disappeared. Even under fire, there was a sense of duration that could be endured. Men pressed themselves flat, waited for the engines to fade, and then emerged to take stock. Survival was measured in moments. The irony was that air power appeared overwhelming, but it was often imprecise at the level that mattered to infantry. Bombs were designed for targets, bridges, rail yards, columns, not foxholes. A bomb that missed by 50 meters might as well have missed by a mile. The spectacle was enormous, the destruction undeniable, but the danger to any one man was uncertain. Artillery was different. It did not roar past. It stayed. Shells arrived in sequences, adjusted and corrected, walking fire across a position with patient intent. Where bombs struck once, artillery returned again and again. It searched. It learned. It found men, wherever they hid behind stone walls, in tree lines, beneath earth, that could not absorb another shock. Infantry learned that concealment offered no guarantee. Dugouts collapsed. Forests burst into splinters. The ground itself became an accomplice to the fire falling upon it. There was no moment to wait out. The barrage might last minutes or hours. It was impossible to know. This was the revelation that reordered fear. Terror was not defined by spectacle, but by duration. Not by what could be seen, but by what could not be escaped. Aircraft threatened bodies. Artillery threatened endurance, patience, and the belief that time would eventually bring relief. And as commanders took note of what truly wore men down, they began to shape their battles around that understanding, quietly preparing to let time itself become a... American doctrine approached the battlefield with a different set of assumptions. Where European armies often emphasized maneuver, initiative, and decisive movement, the United States placed its faith elsewhere. Firepower came first. Movement followed. The belief was simple and unapologetic. If destruction could be delivered at distance, then lives need not be spent earning ground yard by yard. To German observers, this appeared unsophisticated. American units were often described as cautious, even slow. They advanced deliberately, sometimes halting for hours before an engagement. What was misunderstood was that these pauses were not hesitation. They were preparation. Artillery was not an accessory to American infantry. It was the main effort. This realization came as a shock. In U.S. formations, artillery officers sat close to the front, radios always live, maps already marked. Fire missions were requested, adjusted, and delivered with a speed that collapsed the traditional sequence of battle. Engagements no longer began with contact. They began with shelling. By the time infantry moved, the outcome had often already been decided. The irony was that German commanders, seasoned and confident in their tactical skill, underestimated this coordination. They expected artillery to be slow, centralized, bound by hierarchy. Instead, they encountered a system designed for delegation and trust. Forward observers could summon entire battalions of guns with a few precise corrections. What looked like disorder was, in fact, a carefully engineered flexibility. For the infantry facing it, the struggle became psychological as much as physical. Every movement, every attempt to probe or counterattack was preceded by fire. Roads were shelled before columns formed. Tree lines were struck before patrols advanced. Villages were reduced before they were entered. There was no clean beginning to combat, only a steady erosion of resistance. This was an industrial battlefield in its purest form. Shells arrived in quantities that spoke of factories rather than fieldcraft. Fire fell not to punish mistakes, but to eliminate uncertainty. The American method sought to remove the need for heroism by overwhelming the environment itself. Survival became less a matter of skill than of endurance. For German infantry, this meant confronting a war that no longer rewarded initiative. The enemy did not rush forward to be repelled. He waited. He calculated. He destroyed first. Only then did he advance into what remained. And as this method proved itself again and again, American planners began to ask a deeper question: not how much firepower was necessary, but how completely it could shape the battlefield before a single rifleman stepped forward. By 1944, the shock no longer came from the explosions themselves, but from their timing. German infantry learned that American artillery could arrive not after a battle had begun, but before it truly existed. A forward observer, often a single officer with a radio and binoculars, could summon fire within minutes, sometimes less. There was no visible buildup, no warning concentration of guns. One moment the line held, the next, steel was already falling. German doctrine struggled to answer this speed. Requests for counter-battery fire moved upward through rigid channels, slowed by distance and caution. By the time a response formed, the American barrage had already shifted or ceased. The battlefield no longer rewarded reaction. It punished delay. What had once been a contest of timing became an exercise in futility. The irony was that this efficiency required fewer shells, not more. American artillery increasingly favored precision over volume. Fire missions were adjusted in tight increments, shells walking methodically across terrain rather than saturating it blindly. Targets were not suppressed. They were removed. A crossroads vanished. A tree line dissolved. A company position ceased to exist as a coherent place. For those on the receiving end, the struggle became existential. Positions were not attacked in the traditional sense. There was no assault to repel, no enemy to outshoot. The ground itself was erased until nothing recognizable remained. Maps lost meaning. Landmarks disappeared. Survival meant abandoning places before they were fully known to the guns. This marked a turning point in behavior. German units began avoiding contact altogether. Patrols moved less. Defensive positions were thinned or left deliberately vague. Engagement itself became a liability. To be discovered was to invite annihilation from beyond sight. The safest position was often the one that was never occupied long enough to be targeted. What emerged was a quiet admission of defeat, not in territory, but in control. American artillery had assumed authority over space and time. It decided where movement was possible and when resistance was tolerable. Infantry on both sides now operated within boundaries drawn not by terrain, but by firing tables and radio signals. This was the revelation that defined the late war battlefield. Artillery no longer supported maneuver. It governed it. The guns dictated the shape of combat before soldiers ever met. And as this reality settled in across the front, American commanders began to recognize that they were holding more than an advantage. They were wielding a system capable of deciding battles before the first shot of small arms was ever fired. The first shock came quietly. Woods that had once promised concealment erupted into splinters. Buildings that had sheltered men for generations of war collapsed inward under repeated concussions. Trenches, carefully dug and reinforced, failed one after another. The landscape itself seemed to turn against those who trusted it. What had always offered protection no longer did. Infantry belief rested on simple principles. Earth absorbs force. Walls block fragments. Depth ensures survival. In 1944, those assumptions began to collapse. American artillery did not strike once and move on. It returned. Corrections followed corrections. Fire adjusted to resistance. Positions that survived the first barrage were marked for the second. Cover became a temporary illusion. The irony was brutal. Protection often increased casualties. Men crowded into dugouts that collapsed under sustained fire. Stone buildings trapped pressure waves, turning rooms into chambers of force. Trees, once shelter, became weapons splintering into high-velocity fragments that cut through flesh and steel alike. The safer a position appeared, the more it drew men together, and the more devastating its failure became. The struggle was not only physical, but temporal. Movement became nearly impossible. To run invited observation. To remain invited destruction. Infantry learned to exist in narrow windows, seconds between salvos, brief lulls that could close without warning. Time itself became unstable, stretching under fear, snapping back with violence. As the barrages continued, decision-making eroded. Orders lost relevance in a landscape that no longer resembled maps. Communication failed under shock and debris. Units fragmented without ever being formally broken. Men found themselves alone, not because they had fled, but because the ground between them had ceased to exist. This was the revelation that settled over the front lines. Survival had been severed from skill. Experience mattered less. Discipline offered no shield. The difference between life and death narrowed to meters, to seconds, to chance. Luck replaced doctrine. Probability replaced courage. For soldiers raised to believe that training could master chaos, this was the deepest wound. War was no longer something that could be navigated. It could only be endured. And as this truth spread through the ranks, commanders on the other side of the guns began to understand just how thoroughly the battlefield could be stripped of certainty, preparing to exploit that emptiness in the final phases of the campaign. The struggle that followed was not marked by movement, but by stillness. Long bombardments settled over positions like weather systems, unhurried and indifferent. Shells did not arrive in climactic waves, but in sustained sequences that denied rhythm or relief. There was no signal for when it would end. Men waited because there was nothing else to do, and the waiting itself became the trial. Under artillery fire, the body learned one lesson quickly. It could endure more than expected. Ears rang, lungs burned, limbs shook and steadied again. But the nerves told a different story. Each incoming round reset the mind, erasing the seconds before it. Fatigue accumulated without motion, muscles locked from crouching, thoughts narrowed. Sleep became impossible, not because of noise alone, but because anticipation never ceased. The irony was stark. Men broke without ever seeing an enemy. No charge was repelled. No rifle was fired in anger. There was nothing to hate, nothing to aim at, nothing to answer. The violence was impersonal, delivered by coordinates and calculations made miles away. Courage, which depended on confrontation, found no place to attach itself. Time behaved strangely under fire. Minutes stretched into indistinct hours. The pause between salvos felt longer than it was, heavy with expectation. Then, without warning, the interval collapsed. Another shell arrived, and the counting began again. Veterans would later describe this distortion more vividly than the explosions themselves, the sense that time had lost its reliability, that the future no longer advanced in a straight line. As the bombardments continued, pressure mounted in subtle ways. Men stopped speaking, not out of discipline, but because words felt unnecessary. Movements became economical, almost ritualistic. A helmet adjusted. A body pressed deeper into earth that no longer felt solid. Each small action was an attempt to assert order in an environment that rejected it. What artillery did best was not killing, it was isolating. Units endured together but felt alone, each man trapped inside his own sequence of waiting and impact. Communication faltered, not always from broken wires, but from exhaustion. Messages lost urgency. Commands blurred into background noise. The mind, overwhelmed, began to simplify the world into immediate sensations: sound, pressure, breath. The revelation came quietly and too late. Psychological collapse often preceded physical defeat. Positions were abandoned not because they were overrun, but because the men inside them could no longer wait. Withdrawal became an act of relief rather than strategy. When infantry finally advanced through shelled ground, they often encountered resistance, already hollowed-out units present on paper, but absent in will. This was not cowardice. It was arithmetic. Human endurance had limits, and American artillery was designed to find them systematically. The barrage did not demand surrender. It made resistance feel irrelevant. By the time firing lifted, the battle had already been decided in the minds of those who remained. Commanders learned to recognize. The admission often came quietly, almost apologetically. Veterans who had faced American artillery would later say that they preferred fighting tanks. The statement sounded irrational to those who had not been there. Tanks crushed positions, fired directly into cover, and advanced with undeniable force. Yet to the men who endured both, tanks felt understandable. They moved. They could be seen. Their danger followed rule. A tank announced itself with sound and shape. Tracks churned earth. Turrets turned with intention. Even under threat, there was a sequence the mind could follow: approach, engagement, withdrawal, or destruction. A soldier could orient himself within that logic. He could choose to hide, to run, to fire. The threat was terrible, but it was legible. The irony was that visibility created comfort. A visible enemy felt safer than an invisible one. Artillery offered no such structure. There was no warning movement, no escalation. Death arrived vertically, without negotiation. Veterans would say that against tanks, they felt afraid. Under artillery, they felt erased. This was the struggle that lingered long after battles ended. Artillery removed certainty, and certainty was the foundation of morale. Even when shells were not falling, their possibility shaped behavior. Men moved differently. They hesitated longer. They avoided places that made tactical sense but felt exposed to unseen guns. The battlefield narrowed not by terrain, but by fear. Over time, this pressure altered units permanently. The turning point was not a single catastrophic barrage, but accumulation. Each bombardment left behind something intangible but lasting. Confidence did not return to its previous level. Positions were occupied more thinly. Patrols shortened their routes. Commanders noticed that formations still obeyed orders, but with diminished conviction. Morale did not collapse dramatically. It thinned. Like metal fatigued by repeated stress, it lost resilience. After artillery, men no longer believed that skill guaranteed survival. They followed doctrine because it was required, not because it felt meaningful. Initiative faded first, then aggression. What remained was endurance, and even that had limits. This erosion reshaped tactics on both sides. German units became increasingly reactive, focused on avoiding detection rather than contesting ground. Defensive depth increased, not to fight longer, but to delay being targeted. Engagements were postponed whenever possible. The enemy was no longer the advancing infantry, but the guns that would follow any contact. American commanders observed this shift carefully. They noted that resistance weakened before casualties peaked, that units disengaged earlier, that counterattacks lost urgency. Fear was no longer a byproduct of combat. It was a shaping force. Artillery had not merely destroyed positions, it had rewritten behavior. The revelation was unsettling in its simplicity. War was being decided less by clashes of arms than by the management of fear. Tanks still destroyed, infantry still advanced. But the decisive factor was what soldiers believed awaited them if they were discovered. Visible threats could be confronted. American commanders increasingly fought the war at a distance. Their primary tools were not whistles or gestures, but maps spread across hoods, radios pressed close to the ear, and coordinates spoken with deliberate calm. The belief was not that men should be spared danger entirely, but that danger should be shaped before they ever encountered it. Combat, in this view, was something to be arranged. This approach shocked those who faced it. Infantry advances no longer marked the beginning of battle. They marked its conclusion. Villages were entered after they had been reduced. Hilltops were occupied once their defenses had been measured, bracketed, and erased. The advance itself was often anticlimactic, a cautious movement through devastation already complete. The irony was unmistakable. Traditional narratives of war celebrated bravery at the point of contact. Here, movement followed destruction, not courage. Heroism was replaced by sequencing. The decisive moments occurred before infantry crossed the line of departure, while radios crackled and fire missions stacked upon one another. By the time rifles were raised, resistance had often been stripped of coherence. This did not mean American soldiers faced no danger. It meant danger was redistributed. Risk was transferred from individuals to systems, from the exposed assault to the calculation that preceded it. The battlefield became something closer to a process than a test of nerve. Artillery was not merely supporting strategy, it was strategy. Maps reflected this transformation. Terrain was no longer just ground to be seized, but space to be denied. A crossroads was valuable not because it could be held, but because it could be destroyed on demand. A forest was not cover, but a grid square awaiting coordinates. The radio tied these abstractions to reality with unsettling speed. What emerged was a form of warfare that felt mechanical in its execution. Decisions were broken into inputs and outputs. Resistance triggered response. Silence prompted movement. The enemy became data, observed, plotted, neutralized. This efficiency unsettled even those who benefited from it. War, stripped of immediacy, lost some of its familiar moral language. Yet within this system lay a paradox. The more mechanical the process became, the more human its consequences felt. Infantry walking through the aftermath encountered bodies without context, defenses without defenders. Battles were won without being fought in the traditional sense. Victory arrived quietly, without the catharsis of confrontation. German forces recognized this shift but struggled to counter it. Their doctrine emphasized reaction and maneuver, but reaction required time, and time was precisely what American firepower removed. Attempts to stand and fight invited destruction. Attempts to withdraw ceded ground without contest. The system allowed little space for adaptation. The revelation for American commanders was sobering. Firepower did not merely support maneuver, it replaced it. Control of the battlefield no longer depended on who advanced faster, but on who could impose their will remotely. War became less about contest and more about management. Not chaos, but order imposed through force. This transformation carried a moral weight that was the shock of the late war was not how battles were fought, but when they were decided. By 1944, many engagements were effectively concluded before opposing infantry ever met. Lines shifted, positions emptied, and objectives changed hands without the dramatic collisions that had once defined combat. The decisive work had already been done, measured in calculations rather than charges. This reality unsettled those who still believed that courage at the point of contact could alter outcomes. Courage remained present, but it had lost its leverage. Mathematics now governed the battlefield. Ranges, rates of fire, response times, and ammunition stocks shaped events with the certainty that no act of individual bravery could overturn. Men advanced into results, not contests. The irony was profound. Soldiers trained for confrontation found themselves navigating aftermaths. A hill was taken not because it was stormed, but because its defenders had been rendered incapable of defending it hours earlier. Villages fell silent before the first squad entered. Resistance dissolved without the visible moment of defeat that tradition had prepared them to expect. This marked a turning point for German defense. Doctrine built on elastic resistance and counterattack struggled to survive in this environment. To defend invited fire. To move invited detection. Units became reactive, responding to pressure rather than shaping it. Initiative shifted decisively to the side that controlled the guns. German commanders attempted to adapt. Positions were dispersed. Communications shortened. Counterattacks were delayed or canceled altogether. Yet each adjustment conceded something essential: the ability to dictate the tempo of battle. The defense no longer unfolded on German terms. It unfolded according to the availability of American fire support. What made this shift so complete was its predictability. Once contact was reported, the sequence followed with near inevitability. Observation led to correction. Correction led to concentration. Concentration led to collapse. The speed of this chain left little room for intervention. By the time infantry approached, the outcome had been determined. For the soldiers advancing, this produced a strange dislocation. They moved cautiously through ground already claimed by force they had not witnessed. They encountered the evidence of battle without the experience of it. Victory felt procedural, almost administrative. The absence of resistance did not feel like triumph. It felt like inevitability. The revelation was not merely that artillery defined victory, but that it redefined war's meaning. Combat became something managed rather than contested. The battlefield was shaped in advance. Its possibilities narrowed until only one conclusion remained. Artillery did not just support infantry. It replaced the uncertainty that once gave battle its drama. This carried moral consequences that lingered beyond the war. When victory is achieved before contact, responsibility becomes diffuse. Destruction is justified by efficiency. The enemy is defeated without being known. War loses its immediacy and gains a troubling clarity. Decisions are clean. Outcomes are final. Yet for all its efficiency, this system demanded something profound from those who relied on it. Trust in coordination. Faith in calculation. Acceptance that human courage, while still necessary, no longer held decisive power. The individual soldier became a participant in a process. The struggle became most visible when German forces attempted to regain the initiative. Counterattacks had once been the Wehrmacht's defining strength. Swift concentrations of men and armor, assembled quickly, striking before an enemy could consolidate. In 1944, that logic no longer held. The moment units gathered, they were found. And once found, they were shattered. American artillery punished concentration with ruthless efficiency. Assembly areas did not remain hypothetical for long. Roads filled with vehicles drew fire. Forest clearings became coordinates. What had once been preparation became exposure. German units discovered that they could no longer mass without consequence. And without mass, The counterattack lost its force before it began. The irony was severe. Speed, once a shield, now invited destruction. Rapid movement generated observation. Observation triggered fire. The faster a unit attempted to maneuver, the more visible it became to forward observers already scanning likely routes. Momentum, instead of carrying forces through danger, pulled danger toward them. This reality hollowed out maneuver warfare from the inside. Counterattacks depend on surprise, timing, and cohesion. Artillery denied all three. Shelling disrupted assembly, severed communications, and delayed movement until windows closed. Units arrived piecemeal, stripped of synchronization, advancing into battles already defined by enemy firepower. German commanders attempted to adapt. Counterattacks were launched at night. Routes were changed repeatedly. Units were broken into smaller elements to reduce detection. Yet each adaptation carried a cost. Smaller forces lacked impact. Night movement slowed coordination. Delay allowed American positions to harden under additional fire support. The counterattack became an exercise in compromise. The turning point was psychological as much as tactical. Officers no longer believed they could outpace American response. Infantry sensed this hesitation. Orders were followed, but without conviction. When artillery fire arrived, as it almost always did, it confirmed a growing suspicion that initiative had already been surrendered. This erosion of confidence was decisive. Maneuver warfare relies on belief as much as doctrine. The belief that movement can create advantage, that action can impose uncertainty on the enemy. American fire superiority inverted that relationship. Movement created certainty. It revealed intent. It invited preemptive destruction. The revelation settled in slowly and painfully. Initiative no longer belonged to those who moved first, but to those who could respond fastest with fire. American artillery operated inside the German decision cycle, collapsing the time between detection and destruction. Counterattacks were not defeated by opposing maneuver, but by anticipation. This changed the character of German defense entirely. Instead of striking back, units dug in and waited, hoping to endure rather than reverse outcomes. The battlefield ceased to be fluid. It became segmented, controlled by invisible boundaries drawn by artillery range and response time. Within those boundaries, German freedom of action shrank to near zero. Fire superiority did more than kill men and machines. It ended choice. When every movement risked annihilation, the range of viable decisions narrowed until only inaction remained. Counterattacks failed not because they were poorly conceived, but because the environment no longer allowed them to succeed. By the end of the campaign, the lesson was unmistakable. The side that controlled fire, controlled initiative, maneuver. Once the heart of operational art, had become subordinate to coordination and communication. Courage, the shock was not confined to the front lines. It traveled backward, carried in reports, after-action summaries, and casualty tables. By late 1944, German field manuals began to change. The language shifted subtly at first, recommendations to disperse, to limit movement, to avoid presenting targets. What had once been lessons learned under fire hardened into instruction. Fear was no longer a private experience. It was becoming doctrine. This evolution carried a deep irony. The German army, long defined by aggression and maneuver, now formalized avoidance as a principle of survival. Concentration was discouraged. Initiative was tempered. Manuals emphasized concealment over engagement, endurance over counterattack. The goal was no longer to seize opportunity, but to escape detection. War was being rewritten as an exercise in not being seen. These changes reflected a turning point in mindset. Defensive war was no longer a temporary phase or a tactical necessity. It solidified into a permanent condition. Units were instructed to assume that any movement would be observed, any observation answered by fire. Planning revolved around minimizing exposure rather than exploiting advantage. The offensive spirit that had once animated doctrine gave way to cautious resignation. Artillery forced this transformation without ever advancing itself. The guns did not need to overrun positions to shape behavior. Their presence alone dictated how the enemy thought. A road unused was as valuable as one destroyed. A position never occupied was as neutralized as one obliterated. Firepower achieved results through anticipation rather than contact. German commanders recognized the shift, even as they struggled to resist it. Orders still spoke of counterattack and recovery, But the underlying assumptions had changed. Subordinates interpreted instructions through the lens of artillery dominance. Aggressive language produced defensive behavior. Fear filtered every decision before it reached the front line. This produced a strange duality. On paper, doctrine remained assertive. In practice, it was cautious to the point of paralysis. Units complied outwardly while adapting inwardly. They delayed movement. They reduced patrols. They accepted loss of ground as the price of survival. The battlefield was no longer contested evenly. It was endured unevenly. The revelation was stark. Artillery could win without advancing. It reshaped the enemy's choices so completely that resistance eroded on its own. Firepower did not need to destroy every position. It only needed to make holding them feel futile. Once fear was codified, the work of the guns was largely done. This carried implications beyond immediate tactics. When fear becomes doctrine, it outlives individual battles. It shapes training, planning, and expectation. New units arrived at the front already conditioned to avoid exposure. Veterans passed on habits born under shell fire. The psychological terrain hardened alongside the physical one. For American commanders, this was both confirmation and caution. They saw that artillery dominance achieved effects once attributed to maneuver and morale. But they also recognized the cost. A war won through impersonal force risked becoming detached from human judgment. The same system that broke resistance also distanced decision-makers from consequence. Yet the outcome was undeniable. German forces fought on, but with the final consequence of American artillery dominance was not found in any single barrage, but in continuity. The guns did not rest in the way soldiers did. Crews rotated, ammunition flowed. Fire missions overlapped. For those under it, the pressure felt unbroken. Day and night blurred into a single condition of expectation. Resistance was no longer tested by moments of violence, but by the absence of relief. This constancy proved decisive. Even when shells were not falling, they were anticipated. Silence did not signal safety. It signaled preparation. German units learned that the absence of fire often meant it was being recalculated. Endurance depended not on surviving impact, but on surviving uncertainty. Over time, that distinction mattered more than casualties. The irony was that the most decisive weapon of the late war was rarely seen. Tanks advanced. Aircraft roared overhead. Infantry occupied ground. Artillery remained distant, anonymous, and largely invisible. Its presence was registered only through effect. Craters, shattered trees, collapsed morale. What could not be confronted directly became the most influential force on the battlefield. Continuous pressure reshaped behavior in subtle ways. Units ceased repairing positions fully, knowing they would not last. Equipment was left behind because retrieval invited fire. Defensive plans shortened in scope, focused on hours rather than days. The future contracted. Survival became a short-term calculation, measured in the next barrage rather than the next objective. What failed first under this pressure was not courage, but endurance. Courage flares in moments. Artillery erased moments and replaced them with duration. There was no peak to prepare for, no single test to pass. The test was ongoing, and it did not reward effort. It rewarded only the ability to remain intact under conditions that offered no feedback, no reassurance, and no clear end. German reports increasingly reflected this exhaustion. Units described themselves as combat ineffective without having been decisively engaged. Strength remained on paper while will dissipated in practice. Men still held weapons, but not conviction. The weapon that never slept had hollowed out resistance without requiring constant destruction. This was the revelation that American commanders came to understand intuitively. Victory did not require perpetual bombardment. It required the credible threat of it. As long as artillery could arrive at any time, in any place, resistance operated under constraint. The battlefield became a space of permanent vulnerability. For the infantry advancing behind this pressure, the experience was disorienting. They moved through landscapes already subdued, encountering signs of collapse rather than opposition. The absence of fighting did not mean the absence of suffering. It meant the suffering had occurred earlier, out of sight, stretched across hours of waiting beneath unseen guns. The moral weight of this method was difficult to articulate. War had always inflicted fear, but here fear was sustained deliberately. The objective was not to shock once, but to persist until resistance thinned naturally. Artillery did not argue with the enemy. It waited him out. By the closing months of the campaign, this approach defined the tempo of operations. Fire was applied methodically, lifted cautiously, resumed when movement was detected. The guns imposed a rhythm that infantry merely followed. The enemy adjusted, withdrew, or endured until endurance failed. There was no dramatic collapse, only a gradual emptying of resolve. In this sense, artillery achieved a quiet supremacy. It did not dominate headlines or memory in the way armored breakthrough. When the war ended and the guns finally fell silent, survivors were asked what they remembered most. Many searched for images, faces, movements, moments of decision. Instead, they spoke of sound, not what they had seen, but what they had heard. Memory returned to them as noise, arriving without warning. Long after the danger had passed, veterans struggled to describe it precisely. Words felt inadequate. It was not simply loudness, but character, the rising whistle, the sudden crack, the pressure that followed. Some remembered the way the air seemed to tighten before impact. Others recalled the silence afterward, thick and unnatural, broken only by falling debris. These sounds endured when visual details had faded. The irony was striking. War is often remembered through imagery: uniforms, flags, advancing lines. For those who endured sustained artillery fire, faces blurred and places dissolved. What remained was auditory. Noise had bypassed reason and lodged directly in the nervous system. Long after names were forgotten, the sound returned intact. This memory shaped post-war lives in subtle ways. A slammed door startled men who had once endured bombardment without moving. Thunder carried them backward in time. Some woke at night convinced that fire was adjusting again, that the pause had lasted too long. They knew where they were. Their bodies did not. What these memories revealed was not weakness, but imprint. Artillery had imposed itself continuously, without the narrative closure of a visible enemy. There was no moment of confrontation to contain fear. Trauma did not attach to a single event. It accumulated. The mind, unable to frame it visually, preserved it as sensation. Veterans rarely spoke of hatred when recalling these experiences. There was no face to assign it to. Instead, they described inevitability, the feeling that something vast and impersonal had passed over them, indifferent to their presence. The gun crews were never seen. The weapon remained abstract. What endured was the knowledge of helplessness. This became the revelation that defined the legacy of artillery warfare. Trauma was not always tied to loss or injury. It was tied to exposure to waiting without agency, to enduring without influence. Survivors carried forward a memory shaped less by what had happened than by how long it had lasted. For many, this altered their understanding of war entirely. They no longer spoke of courage as the defining virtue. Endurance replaced it, the ability to remain present under pressure, to function without belief in control. These were not qualities celebrated in victory parades, but they defined survival. The legacy extended beyond individuals. Families noticed the silences, the pauses before reaction, the way certain sounds halted conversation. The war had ended geographically, but it persisted acoustically. Artillery had reached beyond the battlefield and into memory, shaping how survivors inhabited peace. Historians would later struggle with this aspect of the war. Sound does not photograph easily. It does not appear on maps. Yet it defined experience more reliably than any visual record. To understand what artillery did, one had to listen to testimony, to hesitation, to what was recalled without prompting. In the end, what survivors remembered most was not the moment of victory or defeat, but the condition of being under fire, the waiting, the noise, the knowledge that relief was never guaranteed. These memories did not fade with time. They softened at the edges, but they did not disappear. And as those voices aged and fell silent themselves, they left behind a final lesson, one not about weapons or tactics, but about consequence, that the most enduring scars of war are often carried not in the body or the landscape, but in the sounds that memory refuses. In the end, the conclusion revealed itself with quiet clarity. You could hide from tanks. You could hear planes coming. You could not escape the guns. This was the truth that settled over the Western Front as the war drew to a close, not shouted, not celebrated, but understood by those who had endured it. Steel Rain won the war not because it was dramatic, but because it was reliable. It did not depend on heroism or opportunity. It depended on coordination on factories producing shells by the millions, on rail lines delivering them forward, on radios linking observation to execution in minutes. Individual skill mattered less than the system that surrounded it. War became an exercise in organization. This was the great inversion of earlier conflicts. In previous wars, mastery at the point of contact often decided outcomes. In this one, contact itself was secondary. Decisions were made far from the front, translated into fire plans, and carried out without spectacle. Infantry advanced not to test themselves against the enemy, but to occupy the space left behind by his collapse. The moral weight of this shift cannot be ignored. Artillery did not distinguish between courage and caution, between experience and inexperience. It reduced all resistance to exposure. Those who survived did so not because they were braver, but because they were spared longer. Industrial coordination defeated individual skill with dispassionate efficiency. For German forces, this was a war they could not win on their own terms. Their traditions valued initiative, maneuver, and decisive action. Artillery dominance denied all three. Initiative revealed itself and was punished. Maneuver was detected and disrupted. Decisive action arrived too late, after the battlefield had already been shaped by unseen guns. The irony was profound. The weapon they could not fight directly proved decisive. Artillery did not invite engagement. It imposed consequence. It forced adaptation until adaptation itself became avoidance. Fear hardened into habit. Habit became doctrine. And doctrine ensured that resistance thinned long before it was destroyed outright. For the Americans, this method carried its own burden. Victory achieved through firepower risked becoming abstract. Destruction was managed rather than witnessed. Responsibility diffused across systems and processes. The battlefield was won efficiently, but at a distance. The war was ended, but its human cost lingered in ways harder to measure. Yet, history records outcomes as well as intentions. Steel Rain worked. It broke resistance systematically. It ended maneuver warfare where it opposed it. It defined victory before infantry ever met. And it reshaped how wars would be planned long after 1945. The survivors understood this intuitively. They did not speak first of flags raised or lines crossed. They spoke of sound, of waiting, of the feeling that nothing they did could change what was coming once the guns were brought to bear. The war, to them, was not lost or won in moments of bravery, but in the relentless application of pressure they could neither see nor answer. This is why Steel Rain won the war. Not because it was crueler than other weapons, but because it was absolute. It removed uncertainty. It denied choice. It transformed battle from a contest of wills into a matter of endurance against an impersonal force.